Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're going to dig into a story that's about way more than just healthcare. It's really about how we understand history itself.
Okay, so to really get into this, we first have to understand something kind of fundamental. There are basically two totally different ways to look at the past.
On one hand, you've got what we could call school history. You know the one. It's that simple, heroic story of progress we all kind of learned growing up. But then, on the other hand, there's historians' history. And that one, it's much messier. It's all about digging into the evidence, even when it conflicts, to find a more complicated and honestly a more complete truth.
So the big question is, which one of these really helps us understand the world we live in? Well, today, we're going to use the critical story of Native American healthcare to put these two approaches to the test.
All right, let's start with that official story, the school history version. And this one begins with a really foundational promise from the U.S. government.
So right at the heart of this story is something called the federal trust relationship. Now that sounds pretty official, but what it really means is a binding obligation. We're talking both moral and legal, for the U.S. government to protect tribal interests and provide essential services, especially healthcare.
And let's be super clear, this wasn't some kind of gift. This whole relationship was formed because Native American nations ceded or gave up over 400 million acres of their tribal land to the United States. This was all done through a long series of treaties and agreements.
This promise wasn't just a one-and-done deal. It was reaffirmed again and again over centuries. Just look at this. Back in 1831, the Supreme Court itself called tribes domestic dependent nations. Then you jump forward to 1921, and the Snyder Act officially put federal funding in place for their health. And even as recently as 1976, the Indian Healthcare Improvement Act flat out acknowledged the government's moral duty to provide the highest possible health status. So it's a long, long history.
But from the perspective of many Native Americans, that promise just feels, well, empty. It really hits home when you hear someone like Rebecca Ortega from the Pueblo Santa Clara ask a question that's just so direct. She says, if we gave up all that land, why hasn't our healthcare gone up as well? It's a powerful point.
Okay, so now let's take that official promise and compare it to the reality on the ground. And this is exactly where that historian's history approach, the one that's all about looking at the evidence, becomes absolutely crucial. A report from the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, and get this, it's literally titled Broken Promises, it paints a pretty grim picture. The data just lays it all out, a stark, undeniable gap in health that has stuck around for generations.
Okay, let's look at some of the hard numbers. The death rate for Native American infants is a shocking 150% higher than for white infants. 150%.
Or take tuberculosis. Now, TB rates have gone down for most people, which is great. But for Native Americans, they're still 6 times higher. 6 times.
And remember, a lot of Native Americans live in cities. Well, for them, the death rate from chronic liver disease is a staggering 126% higher than for other people living in those same cities.
Look, these are not just statistics on a page, right? They represent real people, real families, and just deep personal tragedies. You hear a story like Malcolm Boakades. He talks about his grandfather, this incredibly tough guy who was a rancher, busted Mustangs, and then he just saw him devastated by diabetes. That's the human cost behind every single one of these numbers.
So you have to ask, what's driving this? Why does this gap just persist? Well, the report doesn't point to one single thing. Instead, it points to a whole system with built-in structural barriers.
And a huge piece of the puzzle is just chronic underfunding. Take 2003, for example. The Indian Health Service, or IHS, spent about $1,900 per person. Now look at what was spent on the average person in the U.S. that year. Almost $5,100. That is a massive, massive gap in resources. And that funding problem gets even worse when you look at geography. See, over 60% of Native Americans actually live in cities now. But the IHS system, it's mostly designed to serve people on or near reservations. So what happens? Only a tiny, tiny fraction of that urban population is actually served by urban Indian health programs.
And believe me, the barriers don't stop there. You've got facilities that are incredibly remote. On the Navajo Nation, nearly 80% of public roads are unpaved. The buildings themselves are old, averaging 32 years of age compared to just 9 in the private sector. Care often has to be rationed based on what money is available, not on what a patient actually needs. And on top of all that, there's a constant shortage of staff, with nursing vacancy rates hitting 25% in some places. It's just one thing after another.
Okay, Let's step back for a second and connect all of this, the promise and this grim reality, back to how we think about history.
When you look at this overwhelming evidence, the disparities, the systemic failures, that simple school history story of national progress, it just becomes impossible to accept. The official story of the promise just does not line up with the evidence of the outcome. It's a total mismatch.
And listen, this isn't about pointing fingers and finding good guys and bad guys. That's just trading one simple story for another. Instead, what Historians' History does is it pushes us. It forces us to dig into all the evidence to understand a past that is complex and, yeah, often really contradictory.
So what does this actually look like in practice? Well, step one is admitting that history isn't some single settled storybook. It's an ongoing conversation, a debate about what the evidence means. And step two, we use that evidence not to find easy answers, but to build a much deeper, more complex understanding of why our world looks the way it does right now.
And that really brings us to the final thought here. This deep dive into Native American healthcare, it's about so much more than just this one issue. It's really a lesson in how to think about the past. And it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other comfortable school histories that we all carry around? What other stories would just crumble if we really looked at the evidence? What other parts of our shared story are just waiting for us to take a closer look?